So welcome to chapter 2 of this little experiment with recording. Today I'm going to try something a little bit different. I'm going to try to record this PowerPoint with the audio that was already recorded. So it might sound a little bit different today, but it will include all of the same information.
Correlational methods versus experimental methods. Like almost everything, there's advantages and disadvantages to each of these methods. Correlational research usually is easier to conduct. It has a high external validity but a low internal validity. Conversely, experimental research usually has high internal validity but low external validity if it's conducted in the laboratory. So, internal validity deals with whether or not we can conclude that an independent variable is in fact responsible for the variation in a dependent variable. So in other words, we're asking, did the treatment actually cause the effect? External validity is dealing with whether or not the results that we find would generalize to a population as a whole. So in other words, what we're asking is, are the results of this experiment specific to the sample, or would we get the same results if we had other samples? So the previous slide was talking about how sex is not something that can be easily manipulated or randomly assigned, so it's not a true independent variable. However, sex can be a stimulus or a target variable in a true experiment. So, for example, an experiment or a type of experiment that's commonly done in labs like at George Mason would involve sending out identical resumes but manipulating whether the resume has a male or a female name for the applicant. So in these situations, sex would be considered the manipulated independent variable as it's the stimulus or the target variable. And for this experiment, the dependent variable or the outcome of interest would be the number of callbacks a given resume receives. What this graph is essentially telling us is that if we measure multiple time points, then we can parse out whether change in health occurs after a change in employment status or vice versa. So that way we can get a better sense of direction of causality. This slide is looking at participant effects. Demand characteristics refer to the ways in which participants can influence study outcomes. Especially with socially sensitive topics like sexism, issues of social desirability and response bias can come into play, and this is more likely to skew the data when reported attitudes or behaviors are measured in public as opposed to private settings. There's a couple of different ways that researchers try to address these different types of impression management techniques. These are things like ensuring confidentiality, trying to disguise the purpose of the study if that's possible, and having multiple measures of behavior. So for instance, if I were to ask participants whether or not they subscribe to sexist ideologies, pretty much everybody would say that they don't, even though this is not necessarily true. So this social desirability bias is going to be less of a problem when we're using anonymous online surveys or when we're able to successfully disguise the true purpose of the study. And then furthermore, Research on implicit social cognition takes this methodology of disguising the purpose of the study or the questions a step further. Implicit social cognition is concerned with automatic, implicit, or unconscious processes that are underlying judgments and social behaviors. So, for example, research on sexist attitudes can be measured through implicit social cognition. And oftentimes we're going to be using indirect measurements, things like the implicit association test, and this is going to gauge attitudes of which people are unwilling or unable to accurately report. This slide is talking about research conducted between 1982 and the present, and you'll have the opportunity to review these bullet points, but I just wanted to add a little bit of information about a really interesting study that was published in 1999, which was recreating the landmark Aronson and Steele study that was published in 1995 on stereotype threat. Stereotype threat is a situational predicament in which people are or feel themselves to be at risk of confirming negative stereotypes about their social group. And that's the definition for stereotype threat that I took from online by Googling stereotype threat. But this 1999 study was conducted by Spencer, Steele, and Quinn, and it's entitled Stereotype Threat and Women's Math Performance. And what they found was that when a group of men and women were told that women typically performed worse on this math test, a test that was comprised of relatively difficult math problems, what they found was that women did in fact score statistically significantly lower than the men. However, when the stereotype threat was removed, meaning that a group of men and women were not told that women performed worse than the men, there was no statistically significant difference between the men and the women's scores. So what studies like this on stereotype threat demonstrate is that exposure to discriminatory messages about a meaningful identity characteristic is measurably able to impact people's attitudes and behaviors, things like test taking. So these types of studies have been replicated numerous times, and actually chapter 3 of this book is also going to talk a little bit more about stereotype threat. If you're interested in this particular study, though, I've included the citation for the 1999 article in the notes of the PowerPoint slide. the end of chapter 2, and I just wanted to make sure that you guys remember to take the quiz and post your thoughts on the discussion board thread on Blackboard.